Over 30 years of delivering babies and helping women through pregnancy, I've learned something. The human heart doesn't break the way we think it does. It cracks, yes, but those cracks? They let in light that wasn't there before. Let me tell you about Andrea. She walked into my clinic on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I remember the weather wasn't dramatic. No storm, no rain. Just gray light filtering through the blinds. But the moment she sat down across from me, I felt the weight she was carrying. And I don't mean a purse or a coat. Andrea was 34 years old, married to a man named Mark for 6 years. And she had already been told by 2 different OBGYNs, that she would never carry her own child. Never. That word. Such a small word. 5 letters. But when a doctor says it to a woman who has spent her whole life dreaming of feeling a baby kick inside her, that word becomes a door slamming shut. It becomes empty baby showers she'll never have. It becomes the quiet way she looks away when her friends announce their pregnancies. Andrea sat with her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't crying. That surprised me. Usually, women in her situation come in already emotional, already exhausted from grieving. But Andrea was calm. Too calm maybe. "Dr. Sarah," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not here because I think you'll tell me something different. I'm here because my husband asked me to try one more time. And I promised him I would." That broke my heart more than tears ever could. I asked her to walk me through everything. And as she talked, I started taking notes. She had been diagnosed with a condition called Asherman syndrome, scarring inside the uterus from a previous surgery. But the more she described her history, the more I noticed something the other reports had missed. Or maybe something they had simply dismissed. Because here's the truth about medicine that most people don't understand. Doctors are human. We get tired. We have bad days. And sometimes, we look at a patient's file and decide the answer before we've asked all the questions. I didn't want to give Andrea false hope. That would have been cruel. But I also didn't want to close a door that might still be slightly open. "I need to run my own tests," I told her. "Not because I think the other doctors were wrong, but because I want to see for myself." She looked at me then. Really looked. And for the first time since she'd walked in, I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not hope exactly. More like permission. Permission to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over yet. She nodded. "Okay." That one word. Okay. She had no idea what she was about to walk through. And neither did I. I sent Andrea for a specialized ultrasound the next morning. Not the standard one she'd had before. This one was different, more detailed, more exact. I wanted to see the actual landscape of her uterus. The scarring. The healthy tissue. The places where everything had gone wrong. And I wanted to know if there was anywhere left for hope to grow. While we waited for the results, Andrea came back to my office alone. Mark was at work. She told me she hadn't told him she was coming. That she needed to hear whatever I had to say by herself first. That told me something important about Andrea. She was protecting him. Not because he was weak, but because she had already watched his heartbreak watching hers break. She didn't want to put him through another round of bad news, if she could help it. So we sat together. 2 women. Coffee getting cold between us. And I asked her a question most doctors wouldn't think to ask. "When did you stop believing your body could do this?" She blinked. No one had ever asked her that before. "I don't know," she whispered. Maybe the 3rd time a doctor said no. The ultrasound images came back while she was still sitting there. I pulled them up on my screen and studied them in silence. Andrea watched my face, searching for clues. I've learned over the years how to keep my expression neutral during these moments. But with Andrea, something felt different. The scarring was significant. I won't pretend it wasn't. There were areas where the uterine walls had adhered together, creating bands of tissue that would make implantation nearly impossible. Nearly. But there was also a small section, tiny really, where the tissue looked healthy, vascular, responsive. I turned to Andrea and told her the truth. Not the polished, clinical version. The real truth. "This is not going to be easy," I said. "The odds are not in your favor. Most doctors would look at this and tell you to pursue surrogacy or adoption. And those are beautiful paths. I would never discourage them. She nodded, waiting. But, I continued, I see something here that makes me want to try. One small area. A patch of healthy tissue no bigger than my thumbnail. If we can reduce the scarring around it. If we can create the right hormonal environment. There is a possibility. Not a probability. A possibility. Andrea's breath caught. I watched her fight back tears for the first time. What would it cost? She asked. I knew she wasn't asking about money. It would cost you months of uncertainty, I said. Procedures that might not work. Medications that will make you feel like a stranger in your own body. And at the end of all of it, there's still a very real chance that nothing changes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised me. She laughed. Just a small broken sound. Dr. Sarah, she said, I've already spent 6 years feeling like a stranger in my own body. What's a few more months? That was the moment I knew Andrea wasn't like the others. She wasn't asking for guarantees. She was asking for permission to keep fighting. Andrea began the preparation protocol 10 days later. I prescribed a combination of estrogen therapy and something called intrauterine balloon physiotherapy, a process where a small balloon is inserted into the uterus and inflated to gently separate the scarred walls. It's uncomfortable, sometimes painful, and Andrea did it without a single complaint. But here's what she didn't tell me at first. Every night, after Mark fell asleep, she would lie awake in the dark and place both hands on her lower belly. Not praying exactly, just listening, waiting, as if her body might finally whisper back to her. Mark, I should tell you about him. He was the kind of husband every woman hopes for, but isn't sure exists. He came to every appointment, held Andrea's hand during every procedure, and never once said, maybe we should stop. Even when the setbacks started piling up. And they did pile up. 3 weeks into treatment, Andrea called my nurse with a tremor in her voice. She was bleeding. Not heavily, but enough to send ice through her veins. Because for a woman who'd been told she could never carry a child, any blood means one thing. It's over. I saw her immediately. And as I examined her, I felt my own heart drop for a moment. The bleeding was coming from where the balloon had irritated a thin area of tissue. It wasn't a miscarriage because there was no pregnancy yet. But it was a warning. Her body was fragile. Every step forward carried the risk of 2 steps back. I explained this to Andrea while she sat on the exam table, paper crinkling beneath her. She didn't cry. She just nodded and asked one question. Can we keep going? I wanted to say yes immediately. But I've learned that hope without caution is just another form of cruelty. So I told her the truth. The bleeding meant we needed to pause the aggressive treatment. Give her body time to heal. 2 weeks of rest, then we would reassess. 2 weeks. To a woman who has already waited 6 years, 2 weeks feels like nothing. But to Andrea, lying in her bed wondering if every cramp meant her chance was slipping away, those 2 weeks felt like a lifetime. Mark took time off work. He brought her tea she didn't drink, sat with her while she stared at the ceiling. And on the 10th night, something shifted. Andrea later told me she felt a warmth spread through her belly. Not painful. Not alarming. Just present. She didn't tell Mark because she was afraid it was nothing. She didn't call me because she was afraid it was something bad. She just lay there, one hand on her stomach, and made a quiet promise to whatever tiny possibility existed inside her. I'm not giving up on you yet. She didn't know if anyone was listening. But when she came back for her follow-up, the bleeding had stopped completely. The inflammation had gone down. And the small patch of healthy tissue I'd seen before? It looked stronger. If stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to support real stories like Andrea's. Because sometimes the smallest yes is where miracles begin. The transfer happened on a Thursday morning. I remember the date because Andrea had circled it on her calendar at home, and Mark later told me she'd stared at that little red circle for 3 full weeks before the day arrived. 1 embryo. That's all we had. 1 chance. Andrea held Mark's hand so tightly during the procedure that his fingers turned white. I worked carefully, slowly, placing that tiny cluster of cells into the small healthy patch we had fought so hard to prepare. And when I was done, I looked at Andrea and said the only thing I could say. Now we wait. Those 3 words. They sound so simple. But for a woman like Andrea, waiting was its own kind of torture. Every twinge meant something. Every absence of a twinge meant something else. She drove herself crazy analyzing every signal her body sent. The first week passed. Then the second. Andrea came in for blood work, and I watched her pace the waiting room while the lab ran the tests. Mark stood by the window, not saying much, just being there. Sometimes that's all a husband can do. Just be there. When I pulled Andrea into my office and sat her down, I could see she was already preparing herself for bad news. Her shoulders were tense. Her jaw was set. She had built a wall around her heart, and I was about to find out if that wall would hold or crumble. Your HCG levels are elevated, I said quietly. She didn't react at first. The words didn't seem to land. Elevated, she repeated. Pregnant, Andrea. You're pregnant. And then nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there with her hand over her mouth, eyes wide, like she was waiting for someone to wake her up from a dream. Mark knelt beside her chair. Did you hear that? He whispered. She said pregnant. Andrea finally looked at me. But is it real? Or is my body just pretending? That question broke something in me. Because she was right to ask. Chemical pregnancies happen. Early losses happen. Being pregnant and staying pregnant are 2 very different things. I scheduled an ultrasound for 2 weeks later. Andrea walked into that room barely breathing. I applied the gel, placed the wand on her lower belly, and we all stared at the screen in silence. There it was. A gestational sac. Small but perfectly formed. And inside that sac, nothing yet. Too early. But Andrea grabbed my arm and whispered something I'll never forget. It's there, isn't it? Something is there. I couldn't confirm a heartbeat yet. I wouldn't lie to her. But I also couldn't ignore what my eyes were seeing. Her body was doing something no one said it could do. Andrea left that appointment walking differently. Not confident exactly, but no longer bracing for impact with every step. She didn't know that the hardest part was still ahead. And neither did I. The 8-week ultrasound was when everything changed. I remember Andrea lying on the table, that cold gel spreading across her belly, and Mark standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder. Neither of them was breathing. I moved the wand slowly, found the gestational sac, measured it. Everything looked appropriate for her dates. And then I looked closer at that tiny flicker in the center. The heartbeat. It was there. Not strong yet, early heartbeats never are. But it was there, rhythmic and determined, like a small drummer refusing to stop playing. Andrea saw it at the same moment I did. Her hand flew to her mouth, and a sound came out of her that I can only describe as a sob trapped inside a laugh. That's real, she whispered. That's actually real. I nodded. That's your baby girl. I hadn't planned to tell her the gender yet. The words just came out. And the moment they did, Andrea's entire face transformed. All those months of fear and uncertainty melted for just a few seconds. And I saw the mother she was always meant to become. But here's what I've learned about high-risk pregnancies. Those beautiful moments? They're stolen between storms. The weeks that followed tested Andrea in ways I couldn't have predicted. She was diagnosed with cervical insufficiency. Her cervix was shortening too quickly, threatening to send her into labor long before her baby could survive outside the womb. I put her on modified bed rest. No work. No errands. No standing for more than 15 minutes at a time. Andrea followed every instruction perfectly. But her mind? Her mind refused to rest. She told me later that she started counting. Counting hours. Counting days. Counting every tiny movement or lack of movement. She would lie in bed and analyze every cramp, every twinge, every unusual sensation. A small amount of discharge sent her rushing to the hospital at 2 in the morning. It was nothing. But Andrea couldn't trust nothing anymore. Mark called me privately one afternoon. He sounded exhausted. "She doesn't sleep, Dr. Sarah," he said. "She just lies there with her hands on her belly, waiting for something bad to happen." I understood. Andrea wasn't being irrational. She was being realistic. Her body had betrayed her so many times that she no longer knew how to trust it. Every day she remained pregnant felt borrowed. Every night she fell asleep felt like gambling with fate. At 14 weeks, I performed another circlage, a stitch placed around the cervix to keep it closed. The procedure went well. But 3 days later, Andrea spiked a fever. Low-grade at first, then climbing. When she came to my office with flushed cheeks and glassy eyes, I felt my own pulse quicken. Infection during pregnancy is dangerous. Infection after a cervical procedure? It can be catastrophic. I admitted her for monitoring and started antibiotics. Andrea lay in that hospital bed, hooked up to IVs, and asked me a question I wasn't ready to answer. "If you have to choose between me and her, what do I tell Mark to choose?" I couldn't answer. Not because I didn't know the medical protocol, but because no mother should ever have to ask that question. The fever didn't break. That was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. Andrea lay in that hospital bed for 48 hours while we pumped antibiotics into her veins. Her temperature would drop slightly, and we'd all exhale. Then it would spike again, higher than before, and the monitors would start singing their urgent songs. Mark barely left her side. He slept in a chair that couldn't have been comfortable for more than 20 minutes, ate vending machine sandwiches, and held Andrea's hand while she shivered through the chills. On the third day, I walked into her room and found something I'll never forget. Andrea was crying, but not the quiet, controlled tears I'd seen before. These were deep, heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere underground. Mark stood helplessly by the window, his own face wet. "I can feel my body giving up," Andrea whispered when she saw me. "I can feel it, Dr. Sarah. She's fighting, but I don't think I am." I sat on the edge of her bed, something I rarely do. Boundaries matter in medicine, but some moments require crossing lines. "You're wrong," I said firmly. "Your body isn't giving up. It's fighting harder than any body I've ever treated. But it needs help, and I need to ask you something that's going to hurt." She looked at me with eyes that had already anticipated the worst. The infection had spread. What started as a localized response to the cerclage had moved into her uterine lining. The antibiotics weren't reaching deep enough. I had 2 options and neither of them was good. Option 1, remove the cerclage, let the infection drain, and hope her cervix held on its own. But at 18 weeks, without that stitch, the chances of her body going into labor were almost certain. Option 2, keep the cerclage in place and switch to stronger intravenous antibiotics that carried risks for the baby. Potential hearing damage, potential kidney issues, things that might not show up until after birth, if she made it that far. I laid both options out honestly. Andrea listened without interrupting. Mark sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. "What would you do if she were your daughter?" Andrea asked me. That question stopped my heart, because I have a daughter. And imagining her in Andrea's place made my professional detachment crumble. "I would choose the stronger antibiotics," I said. "Because without them, there is no pregnancy to protect. With them, there's a chance. A difficult, uncertain chance. But a chance." Andrea turned to Mark. They had one of those conversations that happens entirely through looks. No words needed. 20 seconds passed. Maybe 30. Then Andrea looked back at me and nodded. "Do it." I ordered the new antibiotics that afternoon. Andrea's fever spiked to 103 that night. The nurses called me at home at 2 a.m. I drove back to the hospital in clothes I'd grabbed from the laundry basket, my heart pounding the entire way. When I walked into her room, Andrea was pale and sweating. The baby's heart rate had dropped. Not dangerously low, but enough to make the monitors sound different. Enough to make me wonder if I had made the wrong call. I stood at the foot of her bed, watching the numbers change every few seconds, and said a quiet prayer. Not the kind you say in church. The kind you say when medicine has done everything it can, and now you're just waiting to see if the universe agrees with your decision. Andrea reached for my hand. Don't give up on her, she whispered. I squeezed her fingers. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. The next 72 hours became a blur of vitals and medications and whispered prayers. I barely left the hospital. My other patients were rescheduled or seen by my partners. Andrea became my world, because if I looked away for even a moment, I was terrified something would slip through the cracks. On the 5th day of admission, something shifted. Andrea's fever began to break. Slowly at first, then steadily. Her temperature dropped to 100, then 99, then finally, miraculously normal. The infection markers in her blood work trended downward. The baby's heart rate stabilized. For the first time in over a week, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, we had turned a corner. But Andrea wasn't celebrating. She had grown quiet during those days. Not withdrawn exactly. More like, transformed. The woman who walked into my clinic with folded hands and careful words had been replaced by someone else. Someone who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. I'm not afraid anymore, she told me on day 6. She was sitting up in bed, eating actual food for the first time in what felt like forever. I spent so many months terrified of losing her that I forgot to be here while I had her. Mark smiled from his chair. He had dark circles under his eyes and a week's worth of stubble on his jaw. But he was smiling. The crisis had passed. But the pregnancy wasn't out of danger. Andrea remained on strict bed rest. Now in the hospital, where we could monitor her around the clock. Every morning I walked into her room and checked the fetal heart rate. Every morning for 2 weeks that little heart was still beating. 21 weeks. 22. 23. Each day felt like a small miracle. Andrea started keeping a journal. She wrote letters to her baby girl. Letters about how wanted she was, how fought for, how loved. She read them aloud to Mark in the evenings, and I sometimes stood outside her door just listening to the sound of her voice. Then came the night of 23 weeks and 5 days. I was at home, finally sleeping in my own bed, when my phone rang at 1:47 a.m. The nurse on the other end spoke in that careful, measured tone that nurses use when they don't want to panic you, but they need you to move quickly. Andrea's having contractions. 7 minutes apart. We've started magnesium sulfate, but her cervix is shortening fast. I was in my car within 3 minutes. No shoes. Just socks and the clothes I'd slept in. I drove faster than I should have, running red lights through empty intersections, my mind racing through every possible intervention we still had left. When I arrived, Andrea was already in the delivery triage room. The lights were dim. Monitors beeped in rhythm. Mark stood beside her, his hand on her forehead, whispering something I couldn't hear. Andrea looked at me as I walked in. And the fear I thought she had conquered? It was back. Darker than before. 23 weeks and 5 days, she said. She's too small. She's not ready. I pulled on gloves and prepared to examine her. My hands were steady. My heart was not. I know, I said. But sometimes babies surprise us. I didn't tell her what I was really thinking. That at 23 weeks, survival rates were low. That every hour we could keep that baby inside mattered more than any medicine we could give her afterward. Andrea gripped the side rails of the bed as another contraction rolled through her. She's coming, Andrea whispered. My body is breaking its promise again. I won't lie to you. Those next few hours were the hardest of my entire career. Andrea's contractions intensified despite the magnesium sulfate. Every 30 minutes, I checked her cervix. Every 30 minutes, the news was worse. She was dilating. The circlage was holding, but barely, like a single thread keeping a curtain from falling. At 3 a.m., Andrea looked at me with eyes that had stopped pleading. She had moved past fear into something else. Something I've only seen in mothers who are about to do the impossible. How long? She asked. Every hour matters, I said. Every hour inside you is 3 less days in the NICU. She nodded. And then she started breathing. Not the panicked, shallow breaths of someone in pain. Deep, intentional, warrior breaths. Mark matched his breathing to hers. They became a single unit lying in that dim room, fighting against a body that wanted to surrender. At 5 a.m., Andrea's water broke. There was no mistaking it. The flood of warm fluid, the sudden change in pressure, the way Andrea's whole body went rigid. Mark hit the call button before I could reach for it. Within seconds, the room filled with nurses. The NICU team was paged. The neonatologist on call, a woman named Dr. Vance who had done this dance more times than she could count, arrived looking grave. I examined Andrea again. 6 centimeters. Too fast. Too soon. She's coming today, I told them both. There was no point in sugarcoating it. We need to prepare for a delivery at 24 weeks. Your baby girl will be extremely premature. She'll need breathing support. She'll need interventions you can't imagine right now. And the next 72 hours will tell us everything about her chances. Andrea didn't cry. She didn't shake. She looked at Mark, then at me, and said 4 words I will carry to my grave. Then let's meet her. The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. Sterile fields were set up. The NICU team prepared a transport incubator. Respiratory therapists tested equipment. And Andrea labored in a way I had rarely seen. Silent, focused, almost meditative. She refused an epidural. She wanted to feel everything. She wanted to earn this. At 7:03 a.m., Andrea's body changed. The labor pains shifted from waves to a single, overwhelming pressure. I positioned myself at the foot of the bed. The NICU team stood ready behind me. Mark held Andrea's shoulders, his face buried in her hair. "Push when you're ready," I said. Andrea bore down once. Twice. 3 times. The baby's head appeared. So small. So impossibly small. Her skin was translucent. I could see the roadmap of veins beneath it. Her eyes were fused shut. Her chest barely rose with each attempted breath. "One more push, Andrea. One more." She screamed. Not from pain. From effort. From every ounce of love she had poured into this impossible pregnancy, condensed into one final, primal moment. And then, at 7:11 a.m., her daughter slipped into my hands. She was tiny, just over 1 pound. Her whole body fit in my palm. She didn't cry. She didn't move. The NICU team rushed forward, and I placed that fragile, beautiful, terrifyingly still baby into their waiting hands. Andrea collapsed against the pillows, panting. "Is she alive?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. Because I didn't know. The NICU team worked in urgent silence, suctioning her airway, stimulating her tiny feet, placing a breathing tube thinner than a strand of spaghetti. The seconds stretched into eternities. 90 seconds passed. And then a sound. Small. Weak. Barely audible over the beeping machines. But unmistakably a cry. That cry changed everything in the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't robust. It was barely a whisper of a sound, more like a tiny gasp followed by a tremor. But it was life. Real, fighting, undeniable life. Andrea's head lifted off the pillow. Mark's hands, which had been gripping the bed rails so tightly his knuckles had turned white, finally relaxed. And I felt something release in my own chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. But here's what I need you to understand. That cry didn't mean she was safe. The NICU team worked swiftly, wrapping the baby in plastic to preserve her warmth, placing a tiny hat on her head no bigger than a golf ball. Her skin was so thin I could see the shadow of her heart beating beneath her chest. Dr. Vance, the neonatologist, moved with practiced precision, checking oxygen levels, adjusting the breathing tube, monitoring the fragile pulse in the baby's umbilical cord. "Apgar scores are low," Dr. Vance said quietly to me. "But she's stabilizing." Apgar scores. A measurement taken at 1 minute and 5 minutes after birth. Most healthy babies score between 7 and 10. Andrea's daughter scored a 3 at 1 minute. At 5 minutes? A 5. Low, but trending in the right direction. Andrea couldn't see any of this from her bed. The NICU team had positioned themselves between her and her baby, creating a wall of medical urgency. All Andrea could hear were the muffled commands. Check the saturations. Increase the oxygen by 5%. We need IN4 access now. And the occasional beep of monitors that seemed to sing in a language only doctors understood. Can I see her? Andrea asked. Her voice was raw, broken, beautiful. Not yet, I said softly. They need to work on her first. But she's alive, Andrea. She's alive and she's fighting. Those words seemed to drain the last bit of tension from Andrea's body. She sagged against the pillows, and Mark caught her, holding her as she began to cry. Not the sobs of grief I had seen before, but something closer to release. Months of fear and hope and terror and love all pouring out at once. 30 minutes passed before the NICU team allowed Andrea to see her daughter. They wheeled the incubator beside her bed. A clear plastic box with ports for tubes and wires and monitors. Inside lay the tiniest human being I had ever seen delivered alive. Andrea reached one finger through a port in the incubator. The baby's hand, no bigger than Andrea's thumbnail, wrapped around it instinctively. Hello, my love, Andrea whispered. I'm your mommy. I've been waiting so long to meet you. The baby didn't open her eyes. She couldn't yet. But something in her vitals calmed. Her heart rate steadied. Her oxygen saturation improved just slightly. Dr. Vance pulled me aside in the hallway. Her face was serious. She has a long road ahead, she said. Brain bleeds are a risk at this gestation. Lung development is incomplete. Infection is still a threat. The next 72 hours will tell us if she has a real chance. I nodded. I had known this. But hearing it spoken aloud made it feel heavier. When I returned to Andrea's room, she was still touching her daughter through the incubator. Mark stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, the other pressed against the plastic. She needs a name, Andrea said without looking at me. I've been so afraid to name her. But she's here now. She's really here. Andrea paused. Then she smiled. The first real smile I had seen from her since this journey began. Her name is Grace. Because every single day of her life is a gift none of us expected to receive. The NICU became Andrea's second home. Not by choice, by necessity. Because loving a micro-preemie means learning to live in a world of numbers. Oxygen saturation numbers. Weight in grams. Milliliter counts of milk that felt insultingly small, until you remembered that her daughter's stomach was the size of a cherry. Grace's first week was a war fought in inches. Day 1, she needed maximum respiratory support. The oscillator ventilator breathed for her. 60 times per minute, a constant hum that Andrea learned to sleep to. Day 2, she developed jaundice. The blue lights of phototherapy turned her already translucent skin into something almost surreal. Day 3, her kidneys struggled. Day 4, they improved. Andrea sat beside that incubator for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. Mark went back to work part-time. They needed his income, and more than that, Andrea needed him to carry some of the normal world back into her life. But at night he returned, and they would sit together, hands intertwined, watching the rise and fall of their daughter's impossibly small chest. On day 4, something extraordinary happened. The nurses allowed Andrea to hold Grace for the first time. Not a traditional hold. This was kangaroo care, skin-to-skin contact that required careful orchestration of tubes and wires. A nurse lifted Grace from the incubator, cradling her like spun glass, and placed her on Andrea's bare chest. Andrea's breath caught. She pulled a blanket over her daughter's back and simply held her. Grace's vitals stabilized instantly. Her heart rate, which had been erratic all morning, settled into a calm rhythm. Her oxygen needs dropped by 5%. Her tiny body, which had been fighting every moment of its existence, finally relaxed. She knows me, Andrea whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. She knows my heartbeat. She wasn't wrong. The science is clear. A mother's voice, a mother's scent, a mother's heartbeat are all familiar to a baby carried in the womb. But watching it happen in real time? Watching a baby on the edge of viability find peace simply because she was resting against her mother's skin? That's not medicine. That's something else entirely. The weeks that followed became their own kind of rhythm. Good days where Grace gained 10 grams. Bad days where she lost 15. Days where the doctors discussed brain ultrasounds with careful, measured words. Days where Andrea held her daughter and pretended not to be terrified. At 3 weeks old, Grace graduated from the oscillator to a conventional ventilator. Small victory. At 5 weeks, she tried her first bottle, 2 milliliters of fortified breast milk that took her 20 minutes to finish. At 7 weeks, she opened her eyes for the first time. Andrea was holding her, telling her a story about the snow outside the hospital window, when Grace's dark blue eyes fluttered open and locked onto her mother's face. Andrea stopped mid-sentence. She couldn't continue. She could only stare into the eyes of the daughter she had been told she would never have. Stories of survival like this one are why I believe hope isn't naive, it's necessary. If this moved you, you can show your support for more real-life pregnancy journeys. At 10 weeks, Grace came off the ventilator entirely. She still needed supplemental oxygen through tiny nasal prongs. She still had monitors tracking every breath. But she was breathing. On her own. Her small chest rising and falling without a machine to remind her how. Andrea called me that afternoon. I could hear the smile in her voice before she even said hello. She did it, Dr. Sarah. My baby girl is breathing her own air. I sat in my office, looking out at the gray winter sky, and allowed myself to feel something I rarely let myself feel. Pure, un complicated joy. 93 days. That's how long Grace lived in the NICU before Andrea and Mark finally brought her home. I remember the discharge day clearly. Spring had arrived while they were living inside those hospital walls. The kind of spring that comes quietly, without announcement, where one morning you wake up and the world is simply greener than it was before. Andrea walked into my office that afternoon, Grace bundled in her arms, and I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different, but because she looked exactly as she was always meant to look. A mother, holding her daughter. I wanted you to meet her properly, Andrea said, settling into the same chair where she had first sat nearly a year ago. Hands folded, voice careful, expecting nothing. Not as a patient. Just as us. Grace was small for her adjusted age. She would be for a long time. But her eyes were wide and aware, tracking the light from the window, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling against the blanket. She had grown into a beautiful baby, soft brown hair, her mother's chin, and a quiet alertness that made me think she remembered more of her battle than any of us would ever know. I held Grace for a few moments, felt the weight of her, thought about the night she was born, that silent, terrifying minute and a half when we didn't know if she would cry, thought about Andrea lying in that bed, asking me not to give up on her daughter. I never told you something, Andrea said softly, taking Grace back into her arms. That first day I walked into your clinic. When I said I was only there because Mark asked me to try one more time. I waited. That wasn't true, she admitted. I was there because I wasn't ready to give up. But I was too scared to say it out loud. If I admitted I still had hope, and then you told me the same thing the others did, I don't think I would have survived that. So I hid behind my husband's hope instead of claiming my own. Andrea looked down at Grace, who had fallen asleep against her chest, perfectly content in the place where she had fought so hard to remain. But you didn't tell me the same thing, Andrea continued. You saw something. A glimmer. And you gave me permission to see it too. I sat back in my chair and let the moment settle, because this is the part of medicine no one talks about. The part where the patient becomes the teacher,